more than he to build a better world. The Rockefeller Institute was the first of his philanthropic organizations. Rockefeller Foundation has financed an endless fight against suffering, 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 suffering.
John D. Rockefeller was the richest person to ever live, period, claimed Smithsonian Magazine in 2017. Rockefeller passed away at age 98 on May 23, 1937. The very next day, the New York Times printed an obituary which described his many philanthropic donations. Mr. Rockefeller's benefactions from 1855 to 1934 totaled $530,853,632, of which the greater amount went to the four great foundations he established for the purpose of handling his charities. They were the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial in memory of his wife, and the General Education Board. The cumulative rate of inflation from 1937 to February of 2022 is 2,716%. Adjusting for inflation, John Rockefeller donated $15 billion throughout the course of his life. $15 billion can move mountains. A deeper look at where this money went paints a clearer picture of the type of person Mr. Rockefeller was. The New York Times article goes on to describe the activities of the Rockefeller Foundation, which was founded in 1913, the same year as John Rockefeller's side project, the Federal Reserve. Worldwide in scope, its activities were largely directed to medical research in recent years. The 1936 annual report declared it to be devoted to the advancement of knowledge with research as a chief tool. It financed work in the natural sciences, social sciences, medical science, the humanities, and public health. Since the Rockefeller Foundation conducted no research of its own, it instead funded other organizations to accomplish its goals. The article described various donations and milestones the foundation reached, including financially supporting the International Health Board, establishing the China Medical Board in 1914, funding the Graduate School at Harvard in 1919, establishing the Division of Medical Education in 1920, providing financial support for the Red Cross and the United War Work Fund, and funding the Teachers College of Columbia University in 1920. It also made substantial donations to the General Education Board at Washington University, Johns Hopkins, University of Chicago, Vanderbilt, Rochester, Yale Medical School, and Meharry Medical College. Apart from the $15 billion in donations that the Rockefeller Foundation made, John himself made numerous private donations that totaled $168 million after adjusting for inflation. According to the New York Times article, Mr. Rockefeller made smaller gifts that aggregated less than $100,000 each, but totaled $5,962,839.93. Of course, these are merely the donations that were disclosed to the public. This amount of money can accomplish quite a lot. Now, imagine what it could accomplish over a century ago, when news spread much slower. John Rockefeller personally founded the University of Chicago in 1892. In 1901, he founded the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. This was his first philanthropic organization. The New York Times article introduces us to Rockefeller's right-hand man. At the second annual meeting, it was decided to centralize all research work in the Institute's own laboratory. Dr. Simon Flexner resigned as professor of pathology in the University of Pennsylvania to become director of the Institute. Who was Dr. Simon Flexner, and why did John Rockefeller trust him so much to appoint him to this esteemed position? Simon Flexner, born March 25, 1863, was an American pathologist who discovered polio antibodies in 1911 and worked toward developing the first polio vaccine. At the time, only a small handful of vaccines had been developed, but Flexner was a major proponent of vaccination. Vaccines, even from the early days, were patentable property which ensured a windfall profit in the event of an epidemic or a pandemic. That's not to say that every vaccine ever developed has been patented, as Jonas Salk, creator of the polio vaccine, famously decided not to patent his work. Simon Flexner hailed from a family of 9 children. He had 6 brothers and 2 sisters. The Flexner family became heavily involved in medicine. Simon's eldest brother Jacob aspired to become a doctor, although he eventually became a pharmacist and ran a small drugstore. Abraham, who we will investigate more thoroughly in a moment, became the most instrumental person in the standardization of medical education in America. According to a document published by UC Davis entitled History of Drug Discovery and Development, in the early days, until the late 1800s, most drugs were based on herbs or extraction of ingredients from botanical sources. The synthetic drugs using chemical methods were heralded at the beginning of the 1900s, and the pharmaceutical industry was founded. Many drugs were researched and manufactured, but mostly they were used for therapeutic purposes rather than completely curing the diseases. From the early 1930s, drug discovery concentrated on screening natural products and isolating the active ingredients for treating diseases. The active ingredients are normally the synthetic version of the natural products. These synthetic versions, called new chemical entities, have to go through many iterations and tests to ensure they are safe, potent, and effective. What can account for this massive and sudden 180-degree turn from natural medicine to synthetic medicine? Was this cultural shift entirely driven by discoveries in science, or was it pushed in this direction by special interests?
Now, in contrast, most of nature's remedies are enormously inexpensive. They're available, they're abundant, they're cheap, which means that the medical monopoly did not want you to use any of these medications. The greatest achievement of the modern drug trust was the invention of the $1,000 pill. Nature, unfortunately, has never learned how to make a $1,000 pill. In the 19th century, most Americans thrived on what is called homeopathic medicine, which is mostly naturopathic remedies available through nature in abundance at low cost. Well, the medical monopoly, which was formed in 1847 as the American Medical Association, they didn't like this. They thought, how are doctors going to get rich, and how are we going to control the people through the medical monopoly when they can go to these homeopathic people and get these remedies at very low cost? So the first plank of the AMA was, we will never allow any homeopathic physician to become a member of the AMA, and they never have.
Industrialist Andrew Carnegie and investment banker J.P. Morgan strongly believed in allopathic medicine, or at least its profits. Carnegie and Morgan worked together to expand the influence of the experimental field of allopathic medicine across the West. Ken Adachi, investigative reporter of educateyourself.org, gives us greater insight into how Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, and other wealthy aristocrats conspired to influence the entire medical system for profit. Abraham Flexner was engaged by John D. Rockefeller to run around the country and evaluate the effectiveness of therapies taught in medical schools and other institutions of the healing arts. Rockefeller wanted to dominate control over petroleum, petrochemicals, and pharmaceuticals, which are derived from coal tars or crude oil. He arranged for his company, Standard Oil of New Jersey, to obtain a controlling interest in a huge German drug cartel called IG Farben. He pulled in his stronger competitors like Andrew Carnegie and J.P. Morgan as partners, while making other, less powerful players stockholders in Standard Oil. Those who would not come to the fold were crushed, according to a Rockefeller biographer. Rockefeller used his foundations to control the education system. Historians like Eustace Mullins have pointed out that the Rockefeller Foundations were effectively lobbying organizations that offered large grants and donations to those who would play ball. Everything was being influenced by money, including university medical curriculums, health insurance, hospital protocols, and official stances of medical institutions like the American Medical Association. The AMA, which existed since 1847, was then commandeered and granted exclusive authority for the issuance of physicians' licenses and the certification process for schools. Much like how today's globalists are promoting the Great Reset to overhaul the world economy, Rockefeller and his coterie promoted this Great Reset of the healthcare system. Various industries of the West were rapidly being standardized and pre-approved. According to SueYoungHistories.com, Abraham Flexner, the owner of a bankrupt prep school, had the good fortune to have a brother, Simon, who is director of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. At his brother's suggestion, Abraham Flexner was hired by the Rockefeller-allied Carnegie Foundation so that the report would not be seen as a Rockefeller initiative. And Andrew Carnegie, whose main goal was to rationalize higher education, that is, replace religion with science, saw the American Medical Association cartelization drive as useful. Claiming to have investigated nearly every school in the country, Flexner rated them on suitability. Schools he praised received lush grants from the Rockefeller and associated foundations, and almost all the medical schools he condemned were shut down, especially the commercial institutions. AMA-dominated state medical boards ruled that in order to practice medicine, a doctor had to graduate from an approved school. Post-Flexner, a school could not be approved if it taught alternative therapies, didn't restrict the number of students, or made profits based on student fees. To recap everything we have just covered, John Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie were conspiring with many other wealthy acolytes to standardize medicine and push the cultural zeitgeist from natural to synthetic. They achieved this through cooperation between their respective foundations. Meanwhile, Rockefeller's right-hand man and director of the Rockefeller Institute of Medical Research, Simon Flexner, suggested to Andrew Carnegie that he should hire his brother Abraham. Carnegie agreed and hired Abraham to compile a report on all medical schools in the nation. Schools that the Carnegie Foundation disapproved of, using the AMA as a weapon, were shut down, while schools he approved of received lush grants. Abraham's assessment is officially entitled Medical Education in the United States and Canada, although it is commonly referred to as the Flexner Report. In this quote from page 22 of the Flexner Report, we get a clear picture of the medical system that Abraham promotes. He asserts that there must be gatekeepers to regulate who can become a doctor and who can't, to protect the public from doctors who do not conform to the orthodoxy. The privileges of the medical school can no longer be open to casual strollers from the highway. It is necessary to install a doorkeeper who will, by critical scrutiny, ascertain the fitness of the applicant by consideration for a public entitled to protection. What followed was the AMA's systematic suppression, using bribery, propaganda, and coercion on all schools teaching anything other than allopathic medicine. There was a campaign against such practices as Ayurvedic medicine, traditional Chinese medicine, homeopathy, naturopathy, chiropractic, acupuncture, and other traditional forms of therapy. The public's conception of what was considered conventional medicine was quickly shifting from natural to synthetic. The Flexner Report declared that any discussion of patients who had successfully healed from alternative medicine was anecdotal, and those patients probably dodged a bullet by not using allopathic treatment. This narrative didn't seem to generate much pushback from the public, so they continued promulgating it. Throughout the report, Abraham promotes a steep hierarchy to better control the medical industry. Abraham Flexner's employment under Andrew Carnegie, with the mission of standardizing medicine in America, seems to have impressed John Rockefeller, who later hired him to establish curriculums for major Ivy League universities. Philanthropy Roundtable shines a light on these reforms. The Rockefeller Foundation hired Flexner in 1913 to advise its General Education Board. The foundation then systematically funded reforms at several medical schools, including Washington University at St. Louis, Yale University, the University of Chicago, and Vanderbilt University. In 1923, the Rockefeller Foundation gave additional money to reform public medical schools in Iowa, Colorado, Oregon, Virginia, and Georgia. These efforts established a single, high standard for medical education in the United States and launched American medicine to international prominence, a prestige it continues to possess today. Much like the Federal Reserve, the American Medical Association is a private institution. It is comprised of medical professionals. Hypothetically, if it were not for lobbying efforts and revolving doors, the AMA should remain an impartial body capable of genuine regulation. However, Carnegie shows his motivations on page 19 of the Flexner Report, where he calls for the transference of regulatory power from the AMA to the government. The theory of state regulation covers that point. In the act of granting the right to confer degrees, the state vouches for them. Through protective boards, it still further seeks to safeguard the people. Much like the rapid spread of authoritarianism during the COVID-19 bioterror attack, public health is often used to gin up hysteria and support for tyrannical policies. Hypnotic phrases like safeguard the people, public safety, and the greater good are often red flags that should give the public pause to discern if what they are being told is propaganda or not. It is all too often the preamble for the rollout of progressive economic policies and a government power grab. The American Medical Association has been accepting money from the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations since as early as 1910, the same year that Carnegie issued the Flexner Report. Did Rockefeller and Carnegie hash out a master plan allowing them to work so swiftly? In his book, The World Without Cancer, G. Edward Griffin makes the argument that the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations began to support the AMA to control medical education to gain power over this, quote, large and vital sphere of American life. The Rockefeller Foundation has openly discussed its financial ties to the AMA and issued public annual reports on its progress because it knows that through its PR campaign, it has established itself as an infallible philanthropic organization in the eyes of the public. Page 29 of the 1932 Rockefeller Foundation Annual Report admits that many of the early vaccines were developed in Rockefeller Foundation laboratories using Rockefeller funding. Obviously, if you are pro-vax, you likely see this as a good and noble thing. If you are anti-vax, you likely see this and everything else we have just uncovered as more evidence that the most ruthless and powerful people push things on the general population for unethical and even megalomaniacal reasons. Now, 2 years into the COVID-19 pandemic, and the allopathic medical system is being fused with Big Brother, as vaccine passports and social credit systems are rapidly being implemented by nations across the world simultaneously. The long march of standardization seems to be reaching its logical conclusion in this medical technocracy, not unlike the plot from Brave New World. Governing bodies within the healthcare industry, like the World Health Organization and the World Medical Association, are increasingly controlling many aspects of health freedom, and most people simply don't realize this, or they celebrate it as a good thing. Why is there so much censorship coming from big tech around the topic of holistic health? Have they used this sequestered knowledge to profit from sickness and death, and to create both physical and psychological dependency? Confusion around the topic of health stems from both top-down disinformation and from grassroots misinformation. Our current predicament is one of contrived science, coercive medicine, scandalous reporting, predatory regulation, deceptive marketing, subjective diagnostics, systemic indoctrination, willful ignorance, obstructed patents, revolving doors, and assassinated doctors, all masquerading as medical progress.
I'm Vera Sharav. I'm a Holocaust survivor. The global assault on our freedom and our right to self-determination is facilitated by the weaponization of medicine. Then and now, the medical establishment provided the veneer of legitimacy to mass medical murder. The inclination to duplicate Nazi option and once again exterminate millions of people remains a hideous threat. Their objective is global population reduction. The global oligarchs are determined to gain absolute control of the world's resources. If we are to survive as free human beings in a free democratic society, we must join together and avert a catastrophe.
That's how drugs work. Because they're foreign to the body, They might fit certain receptors, but they're not a natural part. They're not something that would normally exist in the body. They're not part of normal tissue. So because of that, they interfere. That is actually by design. And these are the two basic philosophical differences between an allopathic or medical viewpoint and a holistic or natural viewpoint. The natural viewpoint assumes that the body is intelligent, and the allopathic viewpoint assumes that the body makes mistakes for no good reason.